Hi there and welcome. It's Jennifer McGuire, and today I'm going to share with you a few ways to get more out of your embossing powders by using them together. I've done many videos in the past on layering with embossing powders, usually with stamp layering sets, and I'll link to those here. However, today I wanted to show you a few more ways you can use embossing powders together for new looks. By combining some of your basic embossing powders, you can get the look of some of the specialty embossing powders that are out there. And be sure to stay tuned to the end of the video where I'll have a bonus card for you. Now, my first cards will be using the newest Hero Arts My Monthly Hero January kit. I'm using the stamp set that you see there on the top. But this kit also does include some large dies that you see there on the bottom, some inks, some accents, and some fun papers. I really like Hero Arts kits, probably my favorite of all the kits out there because the value is fantastic. You get about twice the value with the price that you pay. Okay, so let's start with that love stamp set. This is a simple layering one where you stamp two images on top of each other to get a fancy love sentiment. I'm starting with the simple image first. I'm centering it up onto a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch pink cardstock piece. I'm using my MISTI stamping tool simply because I'm making 4 cards at once. You do not need a MISTI stamping tool for this. You can use an acrylic block. I used my anti-static powder tool, stamped the word in VersaMark Ink, and I'm adding Hero Arts white embossing powder, which is definitely my favorite. Now I'm going to go ahead and do all 4 cards right now. I'm going to stamp and put embossing powder on all 4 panels, and then I'll heat set them all at once. For my second panel, I'm also using white embossing powder. Each of these cards will show you different embossing powder combinations. Now for the third panel here, I'm stamping with VersaMark Ink again, and this time I'm using Hero Arts silver embossing powder. Now, all of the embossing powders I'm using today are basic powders that I really recommend having because they can be used on so many different cards. Now, this 4th embossing powder, is the Hero Arts White Satin Pearl Embossing Powder. This is a specialty powder, but it's one that I very much recommend because it just gives a pearl look to whatever color cardstock you have. So I'm using pink cardstock here, so this will emboss like a pink pearl on top. It's beautiful. Okay, so let's go ahead and heat set all of these. This first one is just the white embossing powder. I have a second one that's just white embossing powder also. The third one is the silver embossing powder, and the fourth one here, this is that white satin pearl embossing powder from Hero Arts that is just beautiful. Now we could stop here and just move on to the next layer and heat emboss on top of this, but I really want this to stand out and look really cool, and I wanted to show you some ways to combine powders. So I'm actually going to stamp the same image right on top of the first embossing. I used my anti-static powder tool. I'm stamping again with VersaMark Ink right on top of the first embossing layer, and I'm adding a second layer. To this first panel, I'm doing white embossing powder on top of white. This will just give you a more bubbled look, so it really has more dimension to it. It also makes it nice and solid. So now we have white on white here, and it really stands out quite nicely. Now in the second panel, this was also white embossing powder. I'm again going to use my anti-static powder tool. You always want to use that. Then I'm going to stamp right on top with my VersaMark Ink, but this time I'm going to add the pearl embossing powder. So the first layer was white embossing powder. The second layer is that pearl. So since the pearl just gives a pearl look to whatever color is behind it, this will create a white pearl. So it'll look different than just doing the pearl embossing powder directly on the pink cardstock. So with this, I'll end up with a beautiful white pearl look. It's hard to pick up in the video, but it is gorgeous in real life because it gives that pearl metallic look. So by combining these 2 powders on top of each other, I get a completely different look. It's a great way to get more out of your embossing powders and save you from needing a bunch of them. Okay, this is the third panel. This is the one where I did silver embossing. I'm going to stamp right on top of it again and add a second layer of silver embossing. I especially like to double up my metallic embossing powders because it gives such beautiful dimension in a really beautiful metallic look. Now you'll notice I'm stamping right on top of the first image. The MISTI stamping tool or any stamping tool is very helpful in lining that up, but it's not necessary. You could instead just look through the acrylic block to make sure you're stamping right on top, or use a simple stamp positioner. Okay, so here you can see that beautiful layering of silver on silver. Okay, now I'm back to the pearl embossing powder. So this was just pearl embossing powder on top of the pink cardstock. Going to stamp right on top of it and just put another layer of pearl here. So again, I'm doubling up my layers of embossing just so it has more dimension and has smoother results. However, you could totally skip the second layer if you want. So let's take a closer look at the 4 different panels here. That first one on the left is the white on white, so just 2 layers of white embossing powder. The second one there is the white with the pearl on top of it, so it has a pearl shine to it. Hard to see in the video, but it is just gorgeous and is great for solid backgrounds. That third one there is 2 layers of pearl embossing powder, and the fourth is the 2 layers of silver embossing powder. You can see the beautiful dimension and how smooth the results are. Okay, so my favorite is definitely the white with the pearl on top. Now it's time to add the second layer to this love image, and this has lots of detail to it. I'm also going to heat emboss this layer. It's really fun to layer embossing powders together. Okay, so let's start with the first panel where I heat emboss 2 layers of white embossing. I've lined up the second image from that same Hero Art stamp set that provides detail to this, and I'm stamping that with VersaMark ink once again right on top, and this I'm going to heat emboss with silver powder. You can see how beautiful that silver is on top of the white, and it gives lots of detail. However, I want to step this up a little bit, so I'm going to stamp it with VersaMark ink again. Make sure, by the way, that it's cooled completely before you go on to the next layer. Stamp that right on top, and this time I'm using Hero Art's Sparkle Embossing Powder. So what it'll look like is the silver embossing powder with glitter on it. You could use a silver glitter embossing powder, but that is a silver powder with silver glitter in it. This is silver embossing powder with iridescent glitter now on top. So it gives a beautiful shine. It's just gorgeous. And by layering the silver with the clear sparkle embossing powder, we create a new look that is really fun. This is my other favorite combination of embossing powders to use together. Okay, so next I'm going to use that second panel we created where we did 1 layer of white embossing and topped it with a layer of that satin pearl embossing. For this one, I'm going to use some silver embossing powder on top and just double that up. Now, a couple tips if you're layering embossing like I'm doing here. Make sure your heat gun is really good and hot before you bring it to the paper, and just heat it long enough to melt the powder. Don't keep your gun there too long or the embossing might bleed together. I've never had that happen unless I force myself to overheat it. So you can get beautiful results with layering heat embossing. Just make sure your gun's hot. Okay, here is my second layer of silver embossing. You really could skip this if you wanted to, but I again really wanted to add that dimension. And look how beautiful this is. Kind of looks like one of those puffy stickers that I used to collect as a kid. Just beautiful. Okay, so I know it takes a little bit of time to layer up these embossing powder layers, but it really makes it stand out. And really, since this is the focal point of my card, it's worth the effort. The third example is where we did 2 layers of silver embossing powder, and on top of this I simply did 2 layers of white embossing powder. So I'm going to skip through that because it's so basic, but we have 2 layers of white embossing powder, and look how beautiful that white melts into that silver. It looks like it's one smooth image. Okay, the final example is where I have those 2 layers of pearl embossing powder that gives that beautiful pink pearl look. On top of this, I'm going to do white embossing powder. So here I'm stamping the image, adding the white embossing powder, and heat setting it. Now this time I'm going to do the second layer of embossing in clear sparkle embossing powder. So what it will look like is a white sparkle embossing powder, which I don't have, so I created my own by layering them. Hard to see that glitter in there, but boy does it shine. And it looks really cool with that pearl behind it. So all 4 of those examples show different ways to use your basic embossing powders layered together for different looks. So let's finish these off into cards. I have some more tips for you. Here I'm using the Hero Arts Window on Love background die. This is a fantastic background die. It's new and it's an add-on for this release. So you can buy it separate from the kit. And I'm going to die cut this from Vellum. The reason I'm die cutting it from Vellum is because I want a thin stencil. I'm creating my own stencil. You could use typing paper, but I decided to go with Vellum. I'm die cutting this with my Gemini Junior die cut machine, but any die cut machine would work. I have some Micropore tape, and I'm going to tape this right over one of my embossed panels. You can see I'm kind of doing it towards the top because I plan to trim some of that pink cardstock off the bottom. Now I'm using this Vellum die cut piece as a stencil, and over it I'm applying Hero Arts white dye ink. This is not a pigment ink, this is a dye ink, and it creates such a cool look for backgrounds like this. I'm using a Tonic blending sponge to apply it, but you can use any inking tool. When I'm done, I'm going to remove that set stencil that I made, wipe the extra ink off of the embossed areas, and look at how that ink kind of created a softer look of hearts. It almost looks suede in real life. So I trimmed that piece down a little bit. I also created some thin white cardstock strips. Put some liquid adhesive on the back of the strip, and I'm going to glue one at the top of this panel and one at the bottom just for like a finishing look. Now I'm going to add this pink panel onto my 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch white note card with some craft foam so it has some even dimension behind it. I use my liquid adhesive to add that on to the back of our pink panel, and then I'll glue this onto our card. I'll put something heavy on this so it dries in contact with the cardstock and it'll definitely stay put. That craft foam just has a little dimension to it and it allows it to kind of pop up and stand out some more. Next I can trim off those little extra white strips, and I did this with all 4 of the panels that I created earlier. Now from the Hero Arts Acts of Kindness stamp set, I have a sentiment that says, "Thanks for your kindness." I'm going to actually cut the word kindness off and just use the words "thank you for your," and I'll put this on top of the word love. I silver heat embossed that sentiment onto several white cardstock strips. I'm using some narrow foam adhesive strips to add this to the center of our card. I'm using a T-ruler to make sure I do it straight, and now it says "thank you for your love," and I thought this would be a great one to send to some of my favorite crafty friends who are always so encouraging. So there you can see the final card design, and all of the examples show different embossing powder combinations. I'll have photos of all these cards on my blog so you can take a closer look if you want to. I have another example showing how combining embossing powders can create really cool looks. Now this one's a little bit crazy, but I did feel it did a good job showing how effective these techniques are. I'm starting with a piece of bright pink cardstock, and I have again created my own stencil from Vellum using that Hero Arts background die. The reason I use Vellum is it's thin, so I can really get ink into all of the open areas. I'm taking my VersaMark ink pad, and to save time, I'm just going to smoosh it right over my homemade stencil so that I have VersaMark ink in all of those little heart areas. Now when I removed my stencil, I was trying to hurry and I didn't remove the tape first, so I ended up tearing that Vellum piece. If you're careful, you can definitely reuse it many times. So now I have all this VersaMark ink exposed. I'm going to add white embossing powder to it and heat set it. So what we end up with is something that looks kind of like a pattern paper, but it does have shine to it since we used embossing powder. Now I decided to step this up a little bit and combine some other embossing powders with this. I'm using my anti-static powder tool over the whole surface. Always do that because it really gives cleaner results. This time I'm going to use the back of my die as a stencil. So I'm lining it up right over the piece. So this is the cutting edge down. The back of the die is facing up towards the camera. I'm taping my paper to the back of it. Now when I ink over this die, the ink won't go into all the areas as much because remember with metal dies, there's like a metal trim. So all of my hearts will be slightly smaller than the white embossed one. Hard to explain, but you'll see here in a moment. I'm pressing my VersaMark ink over the back of the die here. And then I will clean this die just with some soapy water. And then I'm adding silver embossing powder to all of that exposed VersaMark ink that I pressed on top. And here you can see, because I used the back of the die for that second layer, the hearts are slightly smaller because the die has that metal trim to it. So when I heat emboss this, I have silver hearts with a little white trim, which I think is really fun. Looking back at this, I wish I would have used a softer cardstock to start out with, because it gets darker with this next step. But that's okay, it still gives a great result. So over this entire piece, once it's cooled, I pressed my VersaMark ink. So I covered that entire piece with VersaMark. Now I'm adding on top of the whole piece that same clear sparkle embossing powder. So now all of this will have a beautiful sparkle shine to it. Clear embossing powders make your cardstock darker, so that's why my pink ends up darker in the end. I used a Scenting Hugs sentiment right there in the center. That is from the Hero Arts Prayers stamp and die set. Decided to keep it simple, and then I just put this panel onto a white note card. So you can see how beautiful this ended up being thanks to the layers of embossing powder. Now before I wrap this up, I have a bonus card. I wasn't going to share it because it doesn't have any embossing. However, I have a tip I wanted to share, so I thought I would include it. I used the new Hero Arts Floral Heart with Frame die. You can see the die there. The outline die can be cut separate from the little floral image in the center, so you can use them together or separately. I use them together to die cut from white cardstock. Now the cool thing about this die is it cuts some pieces entirely, so you end up with little openings of flowers, butterflies, and leaves, but others it stays attached a little bit, so you can get some fun dimension. What I do is I go from the back of the die cut, press each through with a craft knife. You could use any kind of tool here. And any that are completely cut will pop through. Any of the others will kind of be popped up so you can get some dimension to it. Hero Arts has lots of these dies, and they're called paper layering dies. They're really fun to use, and they really don't take that long at all to create what looks like a very complicated card. So now I want to create a pink backdrop for that piece, but I want it to be slightly larger than my white heart. So what I did is I used that outline heart die, and I traced it onto some pink cardstock. By tracing the die, I end up with a slightly bigger piece because that die has that metal trim. So this is a really easy way to create a mat for any die that you have. Now I wanted to add this white heart die cut piece on top of the pink with some foam tape, but I don't have foam pieces small enough. So here's a trick that is really helpful. I'm using my distressed collage medium, which is acting as an adhesive, and I'm creating blobs of adhesive all over the back of this white die cut in various places. So I'm doing big droplets so that when I carefully flip this over and put it on the pink heart and not press down, you just want to lay it down softly and then set it aside to dry, and you'll end up with that dimension because those blobs of adhesive will stay blobs and they'll dry that way. So it'll still have that dimension to it. So I'm just going to carefully lay this down. Don't press it down, just lay it there. Then I'm going to scoop it up, set it aside to dry for some time. Later, when I come back, it'll be dried with that fun dimension to it. Now to finish this off, all I did was add a Sending Hugs white heat embossed sentiment to the center from the Hero Arts Prayers stamp and die set. And then I added some tiny little pearls into the center of some of the flowers. You can see how that's popped up thanks to those glue drops that I created. And because this is a paper layering die from Hero Arts, it's got all that fun dimension to it. Just wanted to include that in this video. Okay, so that wraps it up. I hope you'll give this idea of layering embossing powders together to create new looks a try. It's a great way to get new looks from your basic embossing powders. Okay, so if you are interested in these supplies, they're linked below in the YouTube description, but go to my blog for much more information and more sources. In the middle are a couple other layering embossing powder videos that might be interesting to you. I appreciate you stopping by. I hope you have a good week, and I'll see you soon.